Welcome to the Quillette podcast, and this week we'll be talking about the scandal at Oberlin College, the private liberal arts college in the Ohio town of the same name. But it's probably not the same scandal that you're thinking of. Many of you will remember that Oberlin became internationally infamous in the late 2010s, when the college's administrators defamed the owners of a local family-run bakery. But my guest today won't be talking about that Oberlin scandal, but rather a completely separate scandal involving a former professor of religion named Mohammad Jafar Mahallati. I say former because in November 2023, Mahallati was placed on indefinite administrative leave for likely reasons that you'll be hearing about from my guest, Roya Hakakian. Roya, as regular readers of Quillette will know, is the author of an August 8 article entitled "The Professor, His Nemesis, and a Scandal at Oberlin," which not only chronicles the dark past of Mahallati, but also provides a lesson on modern Iranian history that's necessary to appreciate the saga of the man's rise and fall. That story began in the 1980s, when Mahallati, the son of a powerful Iranian cleric, became Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, where he served as an international apologist for the tyrannical Islamist regime that had come to power in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. This was a period during which Iran was fighting a brutal war against neighboring Iraq. As Roya discusses in her article, Iran also was waging a murderous campaign against anti-regime elements within the Iranian population, especially a group called the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iraq, a dissident group that had allied itself with Saddam Hussein's Iraq as part of its failed campaign to topple Ayatollah Khomeini. In the last months of the Iran-Iraq war in particular, the Iranian government engaged in a brutal campaign of dissident suppression by killing several thousand imprisoned Mujahideen members, as well as communists who expressed anti-Islamist beliefs. The mass execution of so many Iranians stands as one of the many bloody human rights stains on the record of Iran's theocracy. But it also had a personal connection to the nemesis in the headline of Roya's article. That would be Laudan Bazargan, an international Iranian human rights activist whose own brother was one of the thousands killed during that 1988 mass execution of political prisoners. And like many other Iranian activists, Barzargan was appalled that the regime's UN mouthpiece during that dark period, Mohammad Jafar Mahallati, should enjoy the gilded comforts of a sun-dappled Midwestern arts college campus, not to mention being feted by the Oberlin community as a supposed champion of peace, reconciliation, and forgiveness. As Roya will discuss, Mahallati's career at Oberlin began almost 20 years ago, after he charmed the college's former president, who'd been invited to Tehran as part of a civil society peace-building project. Shortly thereafter, Mahallati installed himself at Oberlin, where he suggested to locals that he'd somehow been an opponent of the very regime he served. He even established an annual Day of Friendship, as it was called, complete with rainbow flags and peace t-shirts. As Roya documented at length in her Quillette article, Oberlin's administrators were apparently so charmed by Mahallati that they ignored his dark past, as well as his questionable academic qualifications. Later on, it even emerged that he'd been the subject of multiple harassment accusations, though it should be added that these have never been proven in court or anywhere else. Perhaps most worryingly, Mahallati, whose job as a UN ambassador had required him to defend Iran's fatwa against Salman Rushdie, as well as its exterminationist rhetoric against Israel, was also using his educational perch at Oberlin to, at least occasionally, encourage students to pursue religious conversion to Islam, or so he admitted when he was expressing himself in Farsi. Indeed, one of the subplots here is that Mahallati had a message of peace, love, and brotherhood when speaking to fellow Oberlinians in English, while adopting a decidedly Shiite Islamist tone when speaking in Farsi. I'll be discussing all of this and more with this week's guest, Roya Hakakian. Thank you very much for joining the Quillette podcast.
I'm delighted to be with you.
It's a complicated subject, so I want to start maybe with the president of Oberlin who kind of got this started. Could you tell us a little bit about Nancy Shram Dai? Am I pronouncing her name correctly?
Yes, Nancy Shrum Dai became the president of Oberlin, I believe in 1993. And during the time of her tenure, and I think it was probably after 9/11, she was approached by a group that wanted to bring about reconciliation or peace building with Iran and the Middle East.
So she traveled to Iran and had a fateful meeting with the man who's at the center of your article. Could you describe how those two met?
So Nancy Shrum Dai ends up going to Iran with the group Search for Common Ground, nonprofit organization that has had deep roots in different parts of Africa. But after 9/11, it turns its attention to the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, and then when it looked like Iran was going to be the next target of the United States in that region, Search for Common Ground started to actively spearhead efforts to prevent war with Iran. Jafar Mahallati was a consultant with Search for Common Ground. And so when Nancy Shrum Dai goes to Iran, it's with a clear understanding that Mahallati has been instrumental in planning the president's trip throughout Iran in her 2004 trip. And then by the time she returns in 2006, the agenda is far more focused and designed by the Iranians, namely by Mahallati, whose real career outside of Iran began when he was appointed the ambassador to the UN by Iran in 1987. In 1980, a war between Iran and Iraq had begun, and by 1987, it had already been in its seventh year. It was one of the costliest wars and least known wars of the 20th century. But Ayatollah Khomeini was still very resolute that he wanted to carry this war out. He wanted to conquer Baghdad. He wanted to go from Baghdad to Jerusalem. And that's the definitive moment of Jafar Mahallati's career at the United Nations.
One thing I'm curious about is how his name was on the radar for such a prominent post. Like you mentioned in the article, his dad was an Ayatollah.
Exactly. So his father had been major Ayatollah in the city of Shiraz, which is one of the 5 major cities in Iran. And he had his own charitable center, his own estate, his own seminary. And as a result of his father's position, Mahallati himself had been appointed a Hujjatul Islam. And a Hujjatul Islam is 1 degree below an Ayatollah.
In the modern progressive idiom, he was born into privilege.
In religious privilege, which after the 1979 revolution...
That was the currency of the realm.
Precisely. He instantly, overnight, became part of the ruling elite of Iran.
Did you find anything in his record that indicates he was a dissident against the regime?
Everybody in Iran, from the moment you enter the country, the cab driver who picks you up from the airport starts to complain and be critical of the authorities. So the point is, how seriously had he been critical of the regime, and did it mean that he had absolutely pitted himself against the authorities, or that he was voicing some criticism that everybody, to some degree or another, was voicing? So far as I know, he wasn't voicing any criticism that could create a rift between him and the regime. The impression that he had given at Oberlin to the locals and to his colleagues had been that he really meant to do it. He was, in every possible way, he was an anti-regime believer, but couldn't do it because he was deeply attached and dedicated to the cause that his father had created, to the charitable organization, to the mosque, and to the estate. And therefore, he couldn't do it, but he wanted to.
Amid all of the horrors that were created by the Islamist regime, there's one that we're going to talk about because it's at the center of the activism of the woman who, at least indirectly, was responsible for unmasking this professor at Oberlin. It unfolded in, I think, the last months of the Iran-Iraq war. That backdrop is important because of the pretext that the regime used to commit the killings. Could you talk about this murderous outrage that took place in 1988?
So in 1987, Mahallati gets sent to New York to be the Iranian ambassador at the UN. And in the summer of 1988, it becomes very clear that some sort of peace needs to be struck between Iran and Iraq because this war cannot go on anymore. This is at a time when one of the most serious, if not the most serious, opposition to the regime, which is the People's Mujahideen of Iran. It was an Islamist group that had, prior to the revolution, endorsed Ayatollah Khomeini, but then after the revolution had a falling out with him and became part of the opposition. So in 1988, however, they are very, very sensitively positioned because Iraq has given them their headquarters. They were sort of homeless for a while. And Saddam Hussein, the former president of Iraq, realizes that these are the most important serious opposition to the Iranian regime and says, welcome home. I'll provide you with weaponry. You can come into Iraq and make this place your home and do whatever it is that you're doing against the regime that I'm fighting against also. But once they have been disbanded, once they have been pushed back, once they have been conquered and defeated, the regime has to try to figure out how they're going to avenge themselves. And so Ayatollah Khomeini, in the summer of 1988, issues a fatwa. And it basically allowed for the prison authorities to do away with the members of the Mujahideen, especially the ones who were not repentant or had not recanted or abandoned the organization, altogether at all prisons inside Iran. But what happens is that there is an interim committee that comes into existence to carry out this fatwa, which was, by the way, headed by Ebrahim Raisi, the late president of Iran, whose helicopter crashed a couple of months ago, because he was at the time the attorney general in Tehran. And so he and 4 others become members of this committee that goes from prison to prison to identify the members of Mujahideen who are going to be the subjects of the fatwa. And what happens is that in the process of sort of building this killing machinery, they realize that now that we're at it, let's kill the communists who are not repentant either. All told, within the span of 10, 12 weeks of the summer of 1988, 3,000 to 5,000 political prisoners, primarily members of the Mujahideen, but also communists, are killed summarily. Some of these prisoners had already served their sentences and had expected to be released. Their families were planning on coming to pick them up. One of the people who was killed was the brother of the woman Ladan Bazargan, who becomes a key player in bringing down Mahallati at Oberlin.
As you see in the article, the state made a point of not permitting funerals or releasing the bodies because they were scared that those funerals would become flashpoints for dissent. And so you could see how, beyond the ordinary trauma of any family losing a son, there was also the trauma of not having closure.
The families were not only shocked, but they were also told that if they were going to demand any sort of accountability, explanation, that they would be arrested.
To be clear, Mahallati is not accused of killing anybody by his own hand or touring prisons and identifying individuals to be killed. he's at the United Nations. And again, I'm going to jump forward a little bit because later on, he started saying, well, I guess through his lawyers, he said, well, I was in New York the whole time. I didn't know any of this. In that respect, he seems to have been caught out because in your article, you source the diaries and official records of a former Iranian president, Rafsanjani, who indicated that actually in 1988, at the time the worst abuses were taking place, he was back in Tehran, I think at least twice, meeting with officials at the highest level in Iran. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. He was in New York. Maybe while he was in New York, he didn't know. But it's very unlikely that when he traveled to Iran during the peak of the killings in the summer of 1988, was meeting with the highest echelon of the regime, that he didn't hear. But then the other thing that makes it really unlikely for him not to have known is that his father was one of the top elite ayatollahs in Iran. And the issue of the massacre in prisons in the summer of 1988 became a religious flashpoint. And that's because Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been the leader of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and then the supreme leader in 1988, when all of these things were happening, had a successor.
Montazeri, was that his name?
Montazeri was his name. And Montazeri and Ayatollah Khomeini had a huge falling out because Montazeri was against the killings. He called the members of the committee that was going around to prisons and trying the prisoners and then sending them to their death. He said to every single one of them that history will not forgive them and that they were committing a major sin. And you hear in the recording that they're responding sheepishly, that, it's very difficult to stop now because they have started the process and people have already been recruited and the machinery is moving forward and it's very difficult for them to stop. And Montazeri really aggressively tells them that their job is to stop this process because they are committing a sin.
Is there any evidence that Mahallati was allied with the Montazeri faction that opposed mass killing of dissidents?
There isn't.
And in the United Nations, he was a mouthpiece for the official party line. He made public statements in defense, as I understand it, of the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. Is that correct?
Yes.
You didn't have to do investigative work to find out that he had defended the regime's death sentence. This was all out in the public record?
Yes. Transcripts of his various statements and interviews. It was not a hard thing for Oberliners or Oberlinians to justify this because they said, that was his job. He was serving that government and he needed to say those things.
What did he say about Israel, or I think the Zionist state?
That the Zionist state should be annihilated. What really deeply interested me and continues to interest me is that how do these characters get into the United States, becomes an American citizen, for God's sake, and end up benefiting from the goodwill and trust of the most liberal elements within our communities and academia? People who should have said to themselves, by virtue of their high education, because they were university, college professors, and etc., this guy served a very, very bad regime. Let us look into his past a little bit and try to figure out who he is, why he's here, and whether he deserves our trust or not. But none of that happened.
Have you ever met him? Is he one of those people who just charms everyone?
I haven't met him, but I have heard unanimously, even from people who were among the people who had objected to his promotion at the college, everyone said he was magisterial, charismatic.
He seems to have a certain brilliance in knowing what a certain kind of progressive, well-educated American person wants to hear about a culture he or she doesn't quite understand.
100%.
He seems to have cottoned on to that aspect of American academic progressive culture very quickly. Did he learn that at the United Nations?
In the 70s, he had been in the United States doing an undergraduate and a master's degree here. And that's the specific quality of a certain class within the current regime in Iran, that they have been educated in the United States. They know exactly the language that the US academic community wants to hear. And so Mahallati was one of them, but he's not the only one. Even from the time that Khomeini was in Paris and was trying to communicate West, the people who ran his communications were that exact class of people who had been Islamists, who had been educated in the United States or the West, and knew precisely how to talk and how to appeal.
Although you make the point that by the time he got to Oberlin and became a professor there, his academic record was still very thin. Is that correct?
Yes. He had received a PhD by the time he arrives at Oberlin in 2007, and he very quickly expects to be promoted and be tenured. His publications are deeply lacking. He has not built any academic relationships, so people who are recommending him are, celebrities.
So one of my observations, I've done a lot of academic scandal stories, is that sometimes it's easier for people to pull the wool over everybody's eyes at a very small school. I've done stories about Smith College, and I did a huge story in Haverford, which has barely over 1,000 students. And one thing you find at small schools is one or two personalities can very easily dominate campus. Had Oberlin instead been Harvard or Yale or Princeton, which have tens of thousands of students and thousands of faculty, would it have been more difficult for Mahallati to pull this stunt? Because you would have had dozens of native Farsi speakers in all sorts of departments who are like, hey, I know this guy. Is it because Oberlin is so tiny that, first of all, he was able to extend his charm on a personal level? Because these schools, often everybody knows everybody else. It's like a big high school. And also just there weren't that many native Farsi speakers who could call him out.
What would have held him back at probably a larger university wasn't so much his past as it probably would have been the number of his publications and his credentials, his academic credentials.
You did a number of interviews, some on the record, some off the record. It sounds like Mahallati didn't fool everyone at Oberlin. And there was at least one department head who said, you know what, this guy's completely unqualified, right? And that person talked to you.
There were people who weren't questioning, who is this guy? He was affiliated with the Iranian regime. Can we trust him? It wasn't any of that. But there were a couple of people who just believed in the value and the merits of scholarship and were expecting anyone who was coming into their space to have those merits and to bring those values. So they were expecting what was expected from anyone, which was, we want everybody who takes the position of, say, professor to have published 15 peer-reviewed articles, if not, say, 12, if not 10. But Mahallati was lacking. His writing was bad. His English writing was very poor. What he was trying to pass as articles were some poetry translations that he himself had published. There was only a minority that was objecting to his promotion, but not based on, this is very important, but not based on the fact that who is this guy? What do we know about him? But based on his thin academic credentials.
One of the themes that comes out of your piece is that obviously there was Islamophobia in the United States after 9/11. No one disputes that. But to a certain extent, at a place like Oberlin, and for a guy like Mahallati, the backlash against Islamophobia played to his advantage because everyone was so eager, well-intentioned, I suppose, to counter Islamophobic narratives that they kind of went overboard and gave him a free pass. And that included, there were Iranians who protested on his behalf once people wanted to get him ousted.
You and I know that there has been, especially after 9/11, a certain degree of Islamophobia in the United States. And the question then becomes, how do you validly and reasonably counter Islamophobia? The path that Oberlin College and Oberlin as a town took was to counter Islamophobia with Islamophilism. In other words, if there is an irrational opposition to Muslims or anything having to do with Islam, we're going to go into the other extreme and love them all and embrace them all.
There's a concrete example of this phenomenon where, as I understand, at one point they were looking for a job for him and he ended up at Department of Religious Studies.
Department of Religions, they called it.
And their in-house approach was, we're not here to convert people to one religion or another. It's not church or synagogue or mosque. We're here to teach the religious traditions, to educate people about where religions come from and what they believe and whatnot.
And so people can question them and analyze them and understand them.
But that wasn't Mahallati's approach, apparently. You found a document in which he bragged that he was helping people convert to Islam. Is that correct?
He said that in an interview in Iran. So the podcast interviewer asked him, so you're in the position where hundreds of infidels come through your door on an annual basis. So what do you do with those infidels? Do you try to convert them? And he says, some of them, very few, not a big number, see the light in Islam or recognize the path of light, and I help them convert. That interview makes very clear the expectations that Iranians had of him was to be a proselytizer.
It was kind of a twist, though. He told the interviewer, as Islam sweeps countries like the United States, I want to make sure that Shia Islam gets a fair shake. He wasn't just trying to convert people, he was also trying to convert them to a very specific kind of Islam.
Precisely. And that's not something that he says in the interview. He writes that in a couple of articles. He's the theoretician of Shiism in the West. So, in other words, what he is really positing in these articles is, how does Shiism expand its horizons at a time when Islam is on the rise and will inevitably, this is what he says, claim an Islamic empire in all of North America.
Just to be clear, there's no evidence that he was promoting violent jihad in North America.
To the contrary, he has a keen understanding of how to speak and appeal to Western audiences. The moment he presents himself as a peace-loving Muslim who is misunderstood in the West is how he will win hearts and minds. And that's his strategy. That's why the title of his course is Peace, Friendship, and Forgiveness Studies.
To be fair, for many Muslims, it is a religion of peace. But for the Ayatollahs, maybe less so.
Yes, the issue isn't with individual Muslims. The issue is with the ideology and those who are trying to propagate it.
There is a certain genius of branding here, which goes beyond this guy. Once you label a whole field of studies like peace and forgiveness studies and reconciliation studies, anti-colonial, anti-racism studies, it almost makes it impossible to refute some of the often suspect and in some cases extremist propositions, because who doesn't want to be a fan of forgiveness studies? Part of the story goes beyond this one guy to kind of this academic racket that once you brand yourself according to this milk and honey type labeling system, that's your brand too. It's like, I'm kosher because I'm an expert in peace and forgiveness studies. What kind of bigot would criticize that, right? Did he play on that?
Yes, but it's not his invention. There is a class of Islamists who have realized that, one, in order to win hearts and minds, they need to first and foremost infiltrate the academic space. And two, that this violent message that Islamists are spreading in the region cannot sell here. And therefore, they need to soften it, they need to adapt it to the local taste. And therefore, they talk about victimization. The United States, Israel, or Western powers have exploited, colonized them, so on and so forth, or that they're misunderstood, or both, right? And then that their message is only a message of peace, a reconciliation, friendship, and forgiveness. This isn't just something that Mahallati has tapped into. It's something that an entire Islamist intellectual class is doing.
It may not be something that he invented, but he seems to be particularly adept at it. As I understand, he created like some annual peace and friendship day where he was giving out T-shirts and stuff in Oberlin.
Yes. So
this is a guy who understands the combination of progressive naivete, but also like mass retail American politics. Like there's something, a lot of Iranians come to North America and they're extremely successful entrepreneurs. He seems to channel some of that.
100%. You have no idea. And people in Oberlin still talk about Friendship Day. And that's his invention.
Did they hold hands and make a big circle?
Everything.
That sounds awful. Did unicorns fly through the air? Like the whole thing, it sounds kind of childish. Look, I like friendship. Friendship's great. But
were he not a Muslim from Iran,
right,
it is very unlikely that people would have fallen for it. But because he was a Muslim from Iran, because there was this sense that these are the people that our government wants to go bomb, or they gave him a pass and they embraced him. And what I'm really hoping that we can do isn't that we become suspect instantly of Muslims, but that we subject them to the same degree of analysis, expectation, skepticism that we subject each other to.
How did Miss Bazargan finally take this guy down?
Well, I think a combination of factors came. One was that in the process of looking into his background, the lawsuit that a former student of his had filed.
This goes back to Colombia
in 1998.
Oh, by the way, my favorite part of that subplot was when he tried to claim diplomatic immunity.
Right. It had been 10 years since he had been at the UN, but he still claimed diplomatic immunity. And the best part, this didn't make it into the article, is that he actually did manage to get a letter from the Iranian office at the UN mission to say that he was a consultant. He has buddies who...
Sure. Well, he clearly hasn't fallen out with the regime if he's able to call in that favor. But
right.
Briefly, because I've had you on for so long, how did she get the ball rolling to bring him down?
A group of alumni from Oberlin were looking into Mahallati's past, and some of them seemed to really zero in on his anti-Semitic statements from the years at the UN, and then, here and there.
Calling for Israel's annihilation type thing?
Calling for Israel's annihilation. So that was one. The other was the surfacing of this lawsuit, sexual harassment lawsuit.
Which was settled out of court for a financial amount.
Yes.
And a non-disclosure agreement.
Exactly. But the problem was that until Laudan Bazargan showed up and the families started to protest, Oberlin had no knowledge of the lawsuit or the anti-Israeli statements from the UN. So the presence of the families who were protesting at Oberlin, one, the surfacing of the sexual harassment lawsuit, and then the congressional inquiry into anti-Israeli statements and anti-Semitic statements, all of them together made it very difficult for the college to hang on to him. The other thing is that over the past 5-6 years, Oberlin has been in media spotlight in a very negative fashion, and they just didn't want one more.
I mentioned it in the introduction, but the whole thing with Gibson Bakery is kind of very similar, where you had, in that case, smaller scale, you had shoplifting, but you had shoplifters claiming racism, and the university basically lining up to attack an innocent local business. I think they had to pay millions of dollars. There was a defamation trial. But have any heads rolled among senior administrators at Oberlin for either of these two scandals? They seem to be just radio silence. Like, you yourself had a kind of surreal episode there. You were there trying to get answers. And before I let you go, describe this weird conference room visit.
I sent dozens and dozens of interview requests to various professors, deans, Mahallati himself, president, the current president, and nobody was responding to me. Only a few professors who had retired agreed to talk to me, and a couple who wouldn't speak on record. I was already in Oberlin, and I was wondering what was happening. Nobody was saying even no. I just wasn't hearing. And so the head of media relations called me to her office and said, everybody has been forwarding the emails you've sent to me, and I have to say that we'll not give you an interview because we don't think you can be an objective reporter. And I said, why? And they said, well, in 2020, you were among several hundred, and the list included Shirin Ebadi, who is the Nobel laureate from Iran, Azhar Nafisi, who is a renowned nonfiction writer of Reading Lolita in Tehran. All of these people had signed this petition demanding that he be fired, that Mahallati be fired. So I was among them. So she said, we don't think you can be objective. I said, you're correct. I cannot be objective about Mahallati because I know things and I have access to sources that you don't know and have no access to and can't tap into because you don't have the language, you're not familiar with the culture. But what I am objective about is I want to know why it was that you all embraced him, why it was that you lowered your standards for this particular guy.
And they never gave you an answer?
They never gave me an answer. She said, we'll think about it, you think about it, we'll be in touch.
Is Mahallati, where is he now? Is he hanging around Oberlin, like having coffee at Gibson's?
He's not in town, but I don't know where he is.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan.